Right now, at this very moment, somewhere beneath a stretch of empty land in rural New Zealand, construction crews are working around the clock. They're not building a mine, they're not laying pipeline, they're carving out a world, a fully sealed, self-contained world, designed to keep a handful of people alive while everything above ground falls apart. And the person paying for it? Worth more than the GDP of a small country. This isn't a movie. This isn't a thought experiment from a dystopian novel. This is happening, right now. And it's happening on a scale that, when you actually sit down and look at the numbers, is genuinely difficult to process. In the last 5 years alone, sales of high-end survival properties, what the industry calls hardened residences, have increased by over 300%. 300. The companies building these facilities have waiting lists stretching years into the future. The land purchases, done quietly, through layers of shell companies and trusts, have been tracked by investigative journalists on 4 continents. So here's the question that should be keeping all of us up at night. Why now? These are not paranoid people. These are not doomsday preppers living off-grid in the mountains. These are the most connected, most informed, most analytically sophisticated human beings on the planet. People with access to private intelligence briefings. People who hire former CIA analysts and geopolitical risk consultants the way the rest of us hire accountants. When people like that start spending hundreds of millions of dollars to build escape hatches, you have to ask what exactly they're escaping from. That's what this is about. And by the time we get to the end, I think your perspective on the world you're living in right now is going to shift. Maybe just slightly. Maybe more than that. Let's start with a little story. Because context matters here, and the contrast between then and now is stark. Bunkers are not a new idea. During the Cold War, governments around the world built underground facilities designed to preserve leadership and essential personnel in the event of nuclear exchange. The United States had Raven Rock. The UK had Burlington. The Soviet Union built an entire underground city beneath Moscow, a project so vast it reportedly had its own subway system running parallel to the public one. But here's the thing about Cold War bunkers. They were government projects, built by nations, for nations, to preserve the continuity of governments and military command structures. The logic was geopolitical, the funding was public, and crucially, the threat was specific. It was nuclear war, one defined, if terrifying, scenario. What's happening now is different, fundamentally different, and not just in scale. Today's bunker boom is private. It's individually funded, individually designed, and, this is the part that matters, driven not by one specific threat, but by a generalized, multi-vector sense that the world is becoming dangerously unstable. That the systems holding civilization together are more fragile than we like to admit. Robert Vicini, the architect, described a conversation with one of his clients that has stayed with him. The client was reviewing the final specifications for a facility designed to sustain his family and a community of about 80 people for up to 5 years. Everything was in order. The engineering was sound. The social architecture had been thought through carefully. And then the client asked a question that, Vicini said, he hadn't anticipated. He looked at the plans for a long moment, Vicini recalled. And then he said, "What do we owe the people on the surface?" And I didn't have an answer for him. That wasn't a question I'd been hired to solve. What do we owe the people on the surface? I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I'm not sure there's any answer that fully resolves it. But the fact that at least some of the people building these facilities are asking the question, that matters. Because it suggests an awareness that survival, even ultra-wealthy survival, doesn't happen in a moral vacuum. The world that exists after a major disruption, if one comes, will be rebuilt by the people who survive it. And the values they carry into that rebuilding, the sense of obligation or the absence of it, will shape whatever comes next in ways that are impossible to predict from where we're standing now. So, where does all of this leave us? We've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at who is building these facilities and the staggering scale of investment involved. We've examined the risk models driving the behavior: climate disruption, geopolitical fragmentation, pandemic vulnerability, technological disruption, and the way serious analysts talk about the interaction between these threats. We've looked at the geography of escape. We've heard from the architects and consultants who've seen this world from the inside. We've engaged seriously with the counter-argument And we've sat with the most difficult question of all, what it means when the most informed people on the planet start building exits. Here's what I think is genuinely true, regardless of which interpretation you find most compelling. The world is more complex, more interconnected, and more fragile than most of us think about day to day. The billionaires building these structures aren't preparing for one bad outcome. They're preparing for a category of outcomes, and that shift from one specific disaster to things could go sideways in any number of ways tells you something important about how the people with the most information are reading the current moment. Dr. Cassandra Vail, a sociologist at the London School of Economics who has spent the last decade studying elite survivalism and what she calls apocalyptic hedging, put it this way in a 2024 interview. What changed around 2018 and accelerated dramatically after 2020 was the psychological shift from linear risk thinking to systemic risk thinking. Wealthy individuals stopped asking, what specific disaster should I prepare for, and started asking, what happens if multiple systems fail simultaneously? That reframing, that's when the serious money started moving. That reframing. Hold on to that phrase, because it comes up again and again when you talk to the people inside this world. So, who exactly are we talking about? Because it would be easy to dismiss this as a handful of eccentric tech billionaires with too much money and too much anxiety. But the picture is considerably broader than that. Investigative reporting, particularly a landmark series by The Guardian, published in late 2023, drawing on leaked documents and interviews with over 40 sources, identified a pattern of large, remote land purchases that began accelerating around 2017. The buyers shared certain characteristics. They were almost universally in the top 0.1% of global wealth. They operated in industries with significant information advantages: finance, technology, energy, defense contracting, and they were buying land in locations that matched a very specific profile. Remote, defensible, climatically stable. Located in politically stable, low population density countries, and, this detail is important, far from major urban centers. Silicon Valley has been particularly visible in this trend. Peter Thiel's purchase of a vast estate in New Zealand became one of the most discussed examples after it was reported by the New York Times. But Thiel is far from alone. Sources within the real estate and architecture communities, speaking anonymously, have described commissions from technology executives, hedge fund managers, and energy sector billionaires for projects ranging from reinforced underground residences to fully self-sufficient compounds capable of operating indefinitely off the grid. Robert Vicini, a former senior partner at a luxury architectural firm in Zurich who now consults independently on what he describes as resilience architecture, spent 8 years designing high-end survival facilities before going public with some of what he'd observed. In a 2025 interview with a Swiss financial publication, he said, "The clients I worked with were not fearful people in the ordinary sense. They were rational. They approached this the way they approached any major investment. They identified a risk, they calculated the cost of mitigation, and they acted. What surprised me was the consistency of what they were afraid of. Across different countries, different industries, different political orientations, the fears converged." The fears converged. We'll come back to exactly what those fears are. But first, let me show you the infrastructure they've been quietly building to address them. Here's something that might surprise you. This industry, the high-end survival real estate industry, is not operating in the shadows. It's hiding in plain sight. Companies like Vivos, Rising S Bunkers, and the most prominent player in this space, a firm called X-Point, which converted a former Cold War munitions storage facility in South Dakota into what it calls the world's largest survival community, are openly marketing their products. They have websites, they attend trade shows, they publish pricing guides. And the numbers are something else entirely. Entry-level hardened residences, what you might think of as a serious prepper's setup, start around $500,000. Mid-range facilities with their own water filtration, air purification, food storage for 5 or more years, medical suites, and communication systems. Those run between $2 and $10 million. But the ultra-high-end market, the category that's driven the explosion in growth, that's a different world entirely. Luxury survival facilities for the ultra-wealthy can run anywhere from $20 million to well over $200 million. These aren't just reinforced rooms underground, they're environments. Facilities designed to sustain a community of 50 to 200 people, potentially for years. They include hydroponic growing systems capable of producing fresh food continuously. They have water sources, often multiple independent ones. They have medical facilities staffed with full-time physicians, gyms, libraries, cinemas, schools. One facility, described in detail by a former contractor who worked on its construction in an undisclosed location in the American West, included a simulated sky ceiling that mimicked natural daylight cycles to prevent the psychological deterioration that comes with extended underground habitation. Think about that. They're not just solving the physical survival problem, they're solving the psychological one too. Dr. Mara Solis, a clinical psychologist at the University of Colorado who has consulted on long-duration isolation environments, including for space agency programs, explained the challenge in a 2024 paper published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology. The engineering of long-term underground survival is, in many ways, a solved problem. The harder problem, the one that the most sophisticated facilities are now addressing, is human psychology under indefinite confinement. The facilities that fail their occupants don't fail mechanically, they fail socially. The most sophisticated bunkers in the world, then, are essentially attempting to engineer not just physical survival, but social cohesion, under pressure, underground. For an indefinite period. The fact that anyone is spending this kind of money to solve that problem tells you something about how seriously they're taking whatever comes next. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Because the question isn't just who is doing this, the question is why are they doing it now? And the answer to that question requires spending a little time in the world of private risk analysis, a world most people never see. There is an entire industry, largely invisible to the general public, dedicated to modeling civilizational risk for high net worth individuals, family offices, and large institutional investors. These aren't conspiracy theorists. These are quantitative analysts, former intelligence officers, geopolitical strategists, climate scientists, and epidemiologists. Their job is to think rigorously and without sentimentality about the ways in which large complex systems, economic, political, ecological, can fail. And when you look at what's showing up on their risk models right now, in 2025 and 2026, a picture emerges that is genuinely sobering. Marcus Wren, a former senior risk analyst for a major London-based sovereign wealth fund who now runs an independent consultancy called Groundwork Strategic Foresight, has become one of the more publicly visible voices in this space. In a presentation delivered at a private conference in Davos in early 2025, a transcript of which was later obtained and published by the Financial Times, Wren outlined what he called the convergence problem. His argument, stripped of its technical language, goes something like this. Human civilization has, over the last century, built an extraordinarily complex, extraordinarily interconnected set of systems. Global supply chains, financial markets, digital infrastructure, food production networks, energy grids. These systems are each individually impressive, but their interconnection, which is also their greatest strength in normal times, becomes their greatest vulnerability when things go wrong. Because these systems don't fail in isolation, they fail together. And when enough of them stress simultaneously, what risk analysts call cascading systemic failure, the feedback loops can move faster than any institution can respond. We are not, Wren reportedly told the assembled audience, in a world where the question is whether major disruption is coming. The question is sequencing and severity, and on both of those dimensions, the window of manageable risk is narrowing. So what specifically are they afraid of? Because, and I want to be careful here to present this accurately, the threat cluster driving the bunker boom is not one single apocalyptic scenario. It's a set of overlapping, interacting risks that, taken together, paint a picture that serious people find genuinely alarming. Climate instability is at the top of almost every risk model, not in the simple sense of rising temperatures, but in the cascading consequences of climate disruption. Agricultural failures, water scarcity in densely populated regions, mass migration on a scale that strains or breaks political systems, The World Food Program has warned that the combination of climate disruption and supply chain fragility creates scenarios within this decade where food security for large populations becomes genuinely threatened. Then there's the question of geopolitical fragmentation. The post-World War II international order, the set of institutions, treaties, and norms that have governed global relations for roughly 80 years, is under more stress than at any point since its creation. Trade wars, great power competition, the erosion of multilateral institutions. The risk models flag this not because any single conflict is necessarily inevitable, but because fragmentation reduces the world's collective ability to respond to other crises when they arrive. Pandemic risk. After 2020, this needs little explanation. But what the risk analysts emphasize is not necessarily the virus itself. It's the institutional and social damage done by the response. The erosion of public trust in governments, media, and science. The revelation of supply chain fragility. The demonstration that societies can fracture along ideological lines with terrifying speed under pressure. And then there's the one that comes up most frequently in private conversations, according to sources who've attended these closed-door briefings. Artificial intelligence and the disruption of economic systems at a scale and speed that existing political institutions simply aren't designed to manage. Not the science fiction scenario of robot armies, the more mundane, and in some ways more frightening, scenario of mass technological unemployment arriving faster than societies can adapt. Of information systems becoming so saturated with synthetic content that shared factual reality effectively collapses. Of critical digital infrastructure becoming so vulnerable that a sophisticated attack could cascade through financial systems, power grids, and communication networks simultaneously. None of these, taken alone, is necessarily civilization ending. But the risk analyst's point, and this is what the billionaires are apparently hearing and acting on, is that the interaction between them is what's dangerous. A climate shock that triggers a food crisis, that triggers political instability, that triggers conflict, that disrupts supply chains, that crashes financial systems. Each step in that chain is individually survivable. The chain itself may not be. Wait. Let me back up for a second, because I want to address something important before we go further. There is an irony embedded in this entire story that even the people building these bunkers are aware of. And it's an irony that, depending on your perspective, is either darkly funny or genuinely troubling. The people most able to survive a societal collapse are, in many cases, the people whose economic and political decisions have contributed most significantly to the conditions creating that risk. Tech billionaires whose platforms have accelerated political polarization, financial executives whose institutions have deepened inequality, energy sector figures whose industries have driven the carbon emissions reshaping the climate. Now, I'm not making a moral judgment here. That's a more complex conversation than this video can contain. But I am noting that the people inside this world are aware of the tension, and some of them have started talking about it. Douglas Rushkoff, a media theorist and author who was famously invited to a private gathering of hedge fund managers to discuss the future, an experience he wrote about extensively, described a question one of the billionaires asked him that he found genuinely haunting. The man wanted to know, earnestly, not rhetorically, whether his security detail would remain loyal to him after a collapse, whether money would still motivate them, whether he should pay them in gold or in stockpiled food or in guaranteed places in the bunker for their families. Rushkoff's observation was sharp. These men had, he wrote, spent their careers believing that money solved problems, and they were now confronting the possibility that in the scenario they were most afraid of, money itself might be the first system to fail. That's a thought worth sitting with. The currency of power in the world above ground may be entirely worthless in the world below it, and the people building the bunkers know this, which is why the most sophisticated facilities aren't just stocked with gold bullion. They're engineered as complete social systems, with governance structures, skill hierarchies, and community roles already mapped out. They're not just building bunkers, they're designing new societies. Small ones, exclusive ones, but societies nonetheless. Now, the geography. Because there is a very clear geographic pattern to where the serious money is going, and it's not random. New Zealand tops almost every list. The reasons are straightforward when you lay them out. It's politically stable, it's geographically isolated, surrounded by ocean, far from every major satswao. Geopolitical flashpoint. It has abundant fresh water. It has productive agricultural land. Its population is small, and its government has historically been pragmatic. New Zealand became aware of the foreign billionaire land purchase trend early enough that it eventually enacted legislation restricting certain foreign property acquisitions. But by that point, significant land had already changed hands. Patagonia, the southern tip of South America, split between Argentina and Chile, is the second most frequently cited destination. Similar logic applies. Remote, climatically stable relative to other regions, low population density, defensible geography, and an agricultural capacity that could, in theory, sustain a self-sufficient community indefinitely. The American Mountain West, particularly areas of Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, has seen significant activity. The appeal here is different. These locations offer proximity to existing social and infrastructure networks. You can drive to a functional city if you need to, while also providing enough isolation and geographic protection to make a hardened facility viable. And then there's a category of destinations that appears on fewer lists, but may be the most telling. Undisclosed locations in Scandinavia, particularly Norway. Geologically stable, cold enough that certain disease vectors are naturally suppressed. Home to some of the world's most sophisticated existing civil defense infrastructure, a legacy of Cold War-era government preparedness. And, crucially, governed by some of the world's most stable, most trusted institutions. When you map all of these locations onto a globe, a pattern emerges immediately. These are places as far as possible from the world's most densely populated, most geopolitically contested, most climate-vulnerable regions. They are, in a very literal geographic sense, the edges of the inhabited world. The places where, if the center doesn't hold, you might still be standing. Some of the most interesting testimony in this entire story comes not from the billionaires themselves, who are, almost universally, unwilling to discuss this publicly, but from the professionals they hire to build and maintain these facilities. Architects, security consultants, logistics experts, physicians who've been recruited to live on site, former military personnel hired to design and manage protection protocols. Several of these individuals have spoken, carefully, usually anonymously, occasionally on record, and what they describe is fascinating. The architect Robert Vizzini, whom I mentioned earlier, described a consistent pattern in the clients he worked with. The first conversation was always about the structure, he said. The physical specifications, depth, reinforcement, blast ratings, air filtration capacity. That part was straightforward. Engineers solved that. The second conversation, and this was always harder, was about the human architecture. Who gets in? What roles they play? What happens when people disagree? Who has authority? What happens to someone who violates the rules of the community? My clients were essentially designing constitutional frameworks for societies of 50 to 100 people. And most of them had never thought about those questions before. The social dynamics question, who gets in, turns out to be one of the most contentious and revealing aspects of the entire enterprise. A 2025 investigation by ProPublica, drawing on interviews with over 20 former employees and contractors, found that the selection criteria for who receives a place in a private bunker community are complicated. Wealth alone, it turns out, is not sufficient. The most sophisticated facilities are explicitly recruiting for skill diversity. Physicians, engineers, agricultural specialists, teachers, mental health professionals, security personnel, people who can perform essential functions in a post-collapse community. One former recruitment consultant, speaking anonymously, described the process this way. The wealthiest clients understood something that the slightly less sophisticated ones didn't. Money buys you the seat. But what keeps the seat viable is having the right people around you. A bunker full of billionaires with no one who can perform surgery, repair a water pump, or manage a traumatized child. That's not a survival community. That's a very expensive way to die slowly underground. That sentence. I keep coming back to that sentence because embedded in it is an entire philosophy of what survival actually requires. And it's not what most of us instinctively think. Here's the piece of this story that I find most difficult to sit with. And I want to take a moment here because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. When the people with the most access to information, the most sophisticated risk models, the most experienced analysts, the most comprehensive intelligence about the state of the world. When those people conclude that the probability of major civilizational disruption is high enough to justify spending hundreds of millions of dollars on underground escape infrastructure, what does that mean for the rest of us? Because here's what we know. We know that these are not irrational actors. We know they're not acting on fear alone. We know they have access to information and analysis that most of us never will. And we know they're acting, in many cases, urgently. The waiting lists at these facilities aren't years long because demand is modest. They're years long because demand has overwhelmed supply. Dr. Elijah Nakamura, a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University who has written extensively on elite behavior during periods of historical crisis, made an observation in a 2024 essay that I've thought about many times since reading it. He noted that in every major historical disruption, the fall of Rome, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Great Depression, the Black Death, the elites of the preceding era had access to early signals that most of the population did not, and their responses to those signals, whether they fled, whether they hoarded, whether they retreated, often preceded the visible collapse by years. The behavior of elites, Nakamura wrote, is one of the most reliable leading indicators of civilizational stress that historians have identified. Not because they cause the crisis, though sometimes they do, but because they often see it coming before anyone else does. When they start acting like they see something coming, it is worth paying attention. Now, I want to be clear. I am not telling you to panic. I am not telling you the world is ending. History is full of false alarms. Wealthy people have made catastrophically wrong predictions about the future. And the bunker industry, like any industry, has a financial incentive to sell fear. But I also think intellectual honesty requires us to sit with what this pattern of behavior actually represents. Not dismiss it, not catastrophize it. Just sit with it and ask what it means. To be genuinely fair, and I think we should be, there is a serious counterargument worth engaging with here. A number of sociologists, psychologists, and behavioral economists have argued that the billionaire bunker boom is less a rational threat response and more a predictable psychological phenomenon among a specific demographic, one that happens to have the resources to act on its anxieties at scale. The argument goes roughly like this. The ultra-wealthy, particularly those who built their fortunes in technology or finance, often share a specific cognitive profile. They are highly analytical. They tend toward systems thinking. They are accustomed to identifying risks before others do and acting on them, because that's often how they made their money in the first place. And they are, in many cases, genuinely disconnected from the social fabric that most people rely on. The neighborhoods, communities, and mutual support networks that provide resilience during hard times. The result, some researchers suggest, is a group of people who are simultaneously very good at modeling risk and very bad at perceiving the buffers that exist in real-world human societies. They see the fragility clearly, they underestimate the resilience, and with billions of dollars and nothing left to buy, they spend their anxiety in the most dramatic way available to them. Dr. Yael Bronfman, a behavioral economist at Tel Aviv University who has studied ultra-high net worth decision-making, put it bluntly in a 2024 interview. Rich people have always bought expensive insurance against unlikely outcomes. The yacht that can cross an ocean, the private jet that avoids commercial airports, the estate in a stable country. Bunkers are just the logical endpoint of that pattern. Security theater at civilizational scale, driven more by status competition and surplus capital than by any genuinely superior risk assessment. That's a compelling argument, and I think it's worth holding alongside the more alarming interpretation. Both can be partially true. The behavior can be simultaneously driven by genuine risk perception and by the psychological peculiarities of extreme wealth. These things are not mutual, ally exclusive. But here's what I keep coming back to. Even if you fully accept the behavioral economics critique, even if you conclude that every single billionaire building a bunker is simply acting out an expensive anxiety disorder, you still have to explain the risk analysts, the people who have no bunkers to sell, no facilities to fill, no financial interest in the fear, the former intelligence officers and geopolitical strategists who are, by their own accounts, telling their private clients the same things in closed-door sessions. What are they seeing, and why does their assessment keep landing in the same place? There's one final dimension of this story that doesn't get discussed enough, and in some ways, it's the most important one. The billionaires building bunkers are not, for the most part, discussing what they plan to do after the crisis passes. After they emerge from underground into whatever world exists on the surface. The facilities are designed for survival. They are not, in most cases, designed for what comes next. And that gap between surviving and rebuilding is where some of the most thoughtful observers of this trend have focused their attention.